I am not this tall. Okay. Should I just give us a wave when we want to start, or do you want to wave at me? Okay. 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 Okay, fantastic. So I think we have all our panelists here, so I think we are going to make a start. So I want to welcome all of you here today, everyone here in the audience, everyone joining us online to Permafrost Day at the Cryosphere Pavilion. This is a whole day program. You can see the schedule from the QR code here, where we'll be talking about the local to the global implications of thawing ground across the Arctic permafrost region. Permafrost thaw releases carbon that has been stored sometimes for millennia into the atmosphere, accelerating global climate change. And as we'll discuss in several of the sessions throughout today, the resulting emissions from permafrost thaw hold tremendous significance for global climate change and therefore, of course, for the negotiations here at COP. But as we've heard throughout this week, and as we will do going forward, mitigating our emissions and enhancing adaptation and resilience are not separate issues. Permafrost thaw is not simply a mitigation challenge. It is first and foremost an issue of human rights and climate injustice. Arctic communities, and particularly indigenous Arctic peoples living on permafrost, are experiencing devastating local effects of permafrost thaw in real time. Such impacts can include, for example, the collapse of the ground surface, increased risk of flooding and erosion, with consequences for the integrity of infrastructure, for people's homes, for cultural heritage, food security, and for health and well-being. And of course, like any ecosystem change, permafrost thaw does not happen in a vacuum. It is both a driver and a symptom of the greater climate crisis that is disproportionately impacting those living in the Arctic region. Climate scientists have advocated for adaptation strategies to reflect the best available science, but that is not enough. Adaptation strategies must be co-produced with those who possess the most in-depth and holistic knowledge of the ecosystem, the strongest connection to the landscape, and who can attest to climate changes through lived experiences. I'm therefore really excited and honored to introduce today's first panel, which will explore some of the challenges faced across the Arctic in achieving this co-production. We'll illustrate examples of success and further consider how scientific, indigenous, and policy communities and the intersections of those communities can better collaborate to deliver just, equitable adaptation across the Arctic. A goal that, of course, ultimately is extremely relevant across communities across the world. So as I say, I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today. Firstly, on our left, we have Panganga Pungoyi, and I'm really sorry for many of our speakers. I'm not going to do a good job of pronouncing your names, so I'd ask you to also state your names as when you begin to speak. Panganga is a member of the Indigenous Environmental Network and an Indigenous mother from Savungak, located in the so-called Bering Strait. Panganga has been involved in many grassroots efforts seeking justice for Indigenous peoples, including efforts to protect lands and waters from extractive industry and seeking justice for Indigenous women. We then have Aslak Holmberg, Vice President of the Sami Council. Aslak is a salmon fisher, teacher, and holds a master's degree in Indigenous Studies. He's also a former member of the Sami Parliament of Finland and now works with various research projects and processes dealing with Indigenous knowledge and rights. We then have Shlava Shadrin, chief of the Council of Yugagir Community, takes an active part, has taken an active part in the indigenous movement in Russia since 1989, and is one of the leaders of the umbrella organization of indigenous peoples of Yakutia. And finally, just on my left here, we have Sunitali. So is a senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, where she leads the organization's Arctic program. She's also the lead of Permafrost Pathways, which is a collaborative initiative advancing just strategies to address Arctic warming. And this is funded through the TED Audacious project. So without further ado, I'd like to open the floor to each of our speakers. And I'd like to start off by just asking a very open question for you to introduce yourselves. Could you please just tell us a little bit about who you are, where it is that you're coming to us from, and a little bit about your own or your community's climate story? Thank you.
Kuya kamsi wanga atka bangangan ng naka bangawi wanga ataka agnaterma naka Kirsten Nugak Pass wanga sivunga kami, and my rumka is Kiwa kami. So I'm Banganga Pangawi. I come from St. Lawrence Island, Sivunga. My father is Agnaterma, and I'm named after his grandmother, and so I've always been called grandmother. I come from a place that has been colonized, and there has been genocide. Climate change was created by colonialism, which has continued genocide. And so I'm bringing with me issues from all across the Arctic, ranging from the impacts of climate change, as well as the impacts of Western science trying to address climate change, which can also be very damaging as well. False solutions such as geoengineering, carbon market mechanisms, a lot of the things that are spoken about here at the UN, where Indigenous people don't have a lot of say. And so we really appreciate platforms like this helping us bring these issues to the forefront.
Yes. Joo, võrriidi pohkade. Mulla on skuvlailema aslah, neljäs aslah ja puhutaan Njurkkanis, tienuleis ja Suomakolle pohtan teikki kuultalihmiin. So good morning everybody. My name is Aslak Holmberg, and I didn't remember to update my bio. I'm actually the president of the Sami Council now. I got upgraded like a couple of months ago. And I come from a village of Njurkkan, which is in the Detnu River Valley in northern parts of Samiland, today what is known as Finland and Norway, right at the border region. So in the Sami community, we have experienced quite radical shifts in our environment. For me personally, what impacts me the most, I'm a salmon fisher, and it cannot be blamed only for climate change, but it is part of the story which is causing a decline of our Atlantic salmon stocks. So in the past few years, we have experienced a dramatic decline in our keystone species, which has caused now that we had just the second summer in a row when the fishing season was closed, so we didn't have any salmon fishing. So this is heavily impacting both our food security and transfer of our knowledge, because our culture as a river Sami is largely built around salmon, and the decline of stocks is really shaking the very foundations of our cultures and as I said, food security. To give another example, the classic Sami livelihood is reindeer herding. So that's also going through some transformational changes. Some regions have experienced this also already a long time ago and adapted accordingly, but other regions have just in the past. Last winter or 2 winters ago, some communities have had to start extra feeding the reindeer because the pastures are locked under a layer of ice, which is caused by warm weather during winter months or rain on snow, which we didn't used to have just a decade ago or so. So people are really having to change the way they practice their livelihoods and yeah, adapt, bring food to the reindeer so that they don't starve when they cannot access their food. This of course brings a lot of extra work. It brings extra economical burden. You have to actually buy the food of the reindeer, while before they were able to graze and find the food in the nature for themselves. So this is just to name a couple of the dramatic changes that we have experienced and that we are actively adapting to. So yeah, maybe that's the start.
Hi everybody. My name is Slava Shadrin. I represent the Yukagir people from the far northeast part of Russia. Permafrost is a part of our life, and that is why it's take much area in our traditional knowledge, and our traditional knowledge are closely connect with permafrost. Uh, our elders says that climate change is a punishment to us, to human, because humans make more bad things. They stop to respect the nature, and that's why it's a punishment. Uh, our elders says that is why the spirit of underworld, it's a mammoth, it's a wake up and bring us many destroyings, many bad things, many problems. For example, destroy our banks of rivers, lakes, destroy our, that is why destroy our buildings, destroy our roads. And something happened with the industrial companies and infrastructure. Uh, I want to say, give example. For example, in 2019, due the permafrost melting, destroyed some dams of our diamond company Alrosa in Yakutia, and all the technical water comes to our rivers, to the Rui, Lena, and it was a very big ecological problems. Or another problem, for another example, in 2020, due to the permafrost melting, was destroyed tanks with the oil of Norilsk Nickel Company, and more than 20,000 tons of this oil comes to the land and to the rivers and go to the Arctic Ocean. And now it starts to be the problem of whole Arctic countries because it's an impact for our life. And you see that it's the impact of melting of permafrost and impact to all our life now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Sue Natali, and I'm a scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. We're an organization based in Massachusetts on the land of the Wampanoag people. And I am an Arctic scientist. I study permafrost thaw and local global impacts of permafrost thaw. And I came to this research because of the accelerated warming that's happening in the Arctic and an understanding of the large potential for the Arctic to impact global climate. I think I transitioned in my understanding of what's happening in the Arctic, not through the graphs and the data that I saw, which is what brought me there, but really through my interactions with Arctic people, observations of the land. And I recognizing the importance of that knowledge and that understanding as a scientist, particularly as a scientist who's not from the Arctic. I'm from, the East Coast of the United States, how critical that is for the work that we do. And so some of the changes that I've seen in the Arctic and the communities that I work with that are happening in the Arctic related to permafrost thaw, but understanding that permafrost thaw does not happen alone. And so we're seeing severe impacts of permafrost thaw, which is causing the ground to sink, leading to more flooding, which is in turn leading to increased vulnerability to erosion. Erosion then causes more permafrost thaw, impacting homes, infrastructure, roads, runways, habitat, impacting rivers and the animals and the land and the water. And so this is, I think, really what drives the work that I do, and gaining a better understanding of the interconnections between the system.
Thank you so much, all of you. I think already your introductory remarks are really speaking to the breadth of the changes and the impacts that we're seeing across the Arctic, and therefore, of course, the fact that adaptation strategies can't be a one-size-fits-all. There's a real depth and complexity of issues that we're talking about here. And so with that in mind, and with the sort of the theme of this session of co-production of adaptation strategies, I wanted to ask you to start off that discussion by telling us what does co-production of knowledge, what does that mean to you? And anyone who would like to speak, feel free.
Yeah, well, I can go first. So perhaps before going that, it's good to highlight some of the challenges that we have experienced, or why there is a need for co-production approach. So I'm myself most familiar with the research related to salmon, and the challenges I've experienced in this cooperation, or including indigenous knowledges into research, is that there is a clear hierarchy of knowledge systems, that it is required that the indigenous knowledge is approved by scientific methods in order for it to make a difference. And often indigenous knowledge is in the kind of form that that it's difficult to evaluate with the scientific methods. Like in this salmon research, it's only the kind of indigenous knowledge that can be quantified that is actually becoming part of the official reports written by the biologists. So there is a lot of qualitative knowledge, for example, relating on the behavior of the salmon, or impact of fishing pressure in different time periods, or changes that have happened in the ecosystems, which are not included in the studies. And also there is a mutual mistrust between scientists and indigenous knowledge holders, because I think the whole cooperation has started on a wrong foot, so to say, with this kind of disrespect, I would say, towards each other's knowledge systems, because it's hard to welcome some people as experts of our river and our salmon who are coming from outside, and from our view they have very brief knowledge compared to the generations of knowledge that we have. So these are some of the challenges I've seen, and I think when we look at co-production of knowledge, it's the most important is that the aims are shared with the participants, and that all participants find it meaningful, that they have goals or questions that they find meaningful for the co-production to answer, so that there is actually willingness and motivation to join this kind of cooperation. What I think would be important in order to ensure this is that there would be a space just for the indigenous knowledge holders to to discuss priorities within themselves. So I think in this kind of co-production of knowledge, there has to be, of course, the common space where um, scientists, biologists, and indigenous knowledge holders cooperate. But I think it's also important to have a space where indigenous knowledge holders can discuss amongst themselves and define what are the key questions for us and what do we need answers to, and also it's important that they discuss and decide amongst themselves what indigenous knowledge they will share with the researchers, because um, indigenous knowledge belongs to the community. It's not up to individuals to decide what to share. For example, in fishing, there is a lot of information that should not be shared, which is actually of even financial value, knowing where it's good to fish and when and so on. So the knowledge holders need to decide amongst themselves what to share and what not to share. So there has to be this collective consent process in place. Um, and also, what's important is that the knowledge holders are part of each of the steps of the co-production process. So it's not like we often in the Sami Council, we get invitations to join a research project when everything is developed already, and they see there is an empty spot that we could maybe benefit their study if they could use our logo and have an indigenous partner. But the research is already defined, and we don't have a very significant say on what the project is actually about. So I think for co-production to be efficient, it has to be defined, co-defined together with the indigenous knowledge holders. I have some other points, but maybe others want to speak also, so I'm gonna stop here for now.
Earlier, our peoples was only an object of social sciences. Only maybe last 10 years, environmental scientists start to recognize traditional knowledge. And only maybe last 3-5 years, we start works with them. And uh, I want to say about some differences. Uh, Traditional knowledge is a common view to the nature, not focus on the details like scientists. And all our view are not connect all the nature processes with the people and others, because we are we live in nature, we are the nature. And that is why our view, our traditional knowledge sometimes bring more bigger practical information, and it can be very helpful to the natural scientists. And our expectation from the co-production of knowledge is more practical results for our communities, because sometimes some scientists says many words. Sometimes we don't receive any information, the results of the research, but we every time think only about the practical results. Maybe this must be the main result of co-production.
So I'd like to talk first a little bit about the challenges of our communities adapting, and then I'd like to talk about co-production of knowledge, if that's okay. So quite frankly, what makes it difficult to adapt are the same things that make it difficult to face any challenge. Lack of tribal sovereignty, lack of self-determination. This translates into colonial rule, bureaucracy, and ongoing oppression. So some practical needs when it comes to climate change, like a community needing to relocate because of erosion. They're blocked in Alaska by policies like INCSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. With respect to many of the wonderful elders and ancestors who did their very best under colonial rule to make a deal with INCSA, INCSA by design is oppressive and harmful to our communities. And I know that in many ways, people who signed that document had no choice. So I just wanted to preface this with that. So if we need to adjust INCSA due to climate change, our peoples are asked to do trade-offs. For instance, if one community needs a 300-foot easement in order to relocate their community, the state of Alaska might change INCSA to grant the 300-foot easement, but ask for 8,000 acres in return, and then grant a tribe in a different region 5,000 acres with subsurface rights. So they kind of divide and conquer us in that way. Of course, colonial oppression means that resources are always a challenge. Our people are absolutely resilient, and we make do with whatever resources that we have available. But we are asking communities to adapt to a rapidly changing climate when they've never even had running water. These challenges are cumulative, almost like a snowball effect. So climate change and climate crisis threatens our basic human needs like food security. Because we need resources, we may be more susceptible to engaging with false climate solutions like selling carbon offsets, or we may buy into a false sense of hope created by dangerous and toxic techno fixes like geoengineering. So in terms of co-production of knowledge, we define that a little bit differently. So oftentimes when Western scientists come to our communities wanting to engage with co-production of knowledge, it's almost like if you've invited us to a meal and you've already selected the restaurant and you've already selected the meal on behalf of us, and then you ask us what we think about that meal. So we need to be there when you build the restaurant and plan what kind of food will be served there. We need to be the ones to define the problem in order for us to be able to define the solution. Oftentimes, the problem is already identified on behalf of us and it doesn't fit our value system. So for meaningful collaboration in our region, in the Bering Strait region, we have a set of questions that we like to be asked when folks are coming to our communities to engage with us. Who should be proposing the research, and is the community an equal partner? What is the purpose of the research? Is the research relevant to the Indigenous community? What is the research trying to prove? What are the understated assumptions in that research? Who will the research benefit? Who will the data be? Will the data be detrimental to the Indigenous community? What are the local laws about sharing that knowledge, like you were talking about? There was a gathering in our communities where some Maori brothers and sisters came up and they shared some thinking with us that really helps us when we're talking about engaging with Western systems in our communities. And there was a set of 3 questions that Bentham Ohai asked, and we often think about. What counts as power? What power counts? And who decides? What knowledge counts? What counts as knowledge? And who decides? And if you're asking those questions and in your projects, when you're trying to engage with Indigenous people, if it's not the Indigenous people who have the power that counts, if it's not the Indigenous people who have the knowledge that counts, the people who are on the front lines, who have been in relationship with Mother Earth for thousands of years, who lived harmoniously and are part of Mother Earth for thousands of years, then the solution that you're trying to push is going to be false and often will result in more detrimental effects. And so when we're talking about co-production of knowledge, we're asking to be there to identify the problem and to identify the questions. We don't want to be there after you've already identified that on behalf of us.
And one additional point, what co-productions means for us. Traditional knowledge holders are not the objects of research. Our traditional knowledge holders are the subject must be the subject of all the research which goes on our territories.
Okay. Yeah, so I will comment on co-production of knowledge. Actually, can't remember what the question was. Which is a lot of the challenges I think are in recognizing that academic and scientific institutions are part of the colonial and extractive system, and those who are trained in those systems are trained in that way of thinking and also constrained by the boundaries of that system. And so when we think about, you know, so first I think there's just the issue of how scientists are trained to think, which is really you're pulled away from the way a brain might normally think, is about seeing the system as a whole place and to really focus in on one thing. So we take the world apart and then maybe we try to put it back together, but you're never going to quite get there. And so I think this is one of the really strong benefits to Western scientists, to working with indigenous knowledge holders, is to try to have this opportunity to relearn and to unlearn the things that you've learned in the past. I think one of the challenges is the system. And so the way that grants are funded to do climate science go directly to indigenous knowledge holders. Essentially, the grants are pretty much available to Western scientists at academic institutions with a PhD, who then can design a project and, as the panel said, reach out to indigenous knowledge holders and say, hey, would you like a piece of this pie, or be a part of this, or have your logo as part of our project? So I think that way of funding science makes it really challenging. Science, so you're going to get a 3-year grant and you have to go in and do it right away, rather than saying, here's a year where we're going to develop a relationship and figure out what the questions are. Recognizing I don't know what the questions are. I have some sense of the questions, I've seen some information, but I need some time to develop relationships. And that's never part of the equation, because we have this sense of urgency. And yet, yes, we have a sense of urgency because of climate change, because people are being impacted, but we're actually, I feel like, taking steps back because we're not taking the time to pause and get a better understanding. Where is there a place for Western science? Where is that needed? Is that needed in that case? And at having the Western scientists stand back a little bit and not just using indigenous knowledge. It's almost like it's like a novelty, I feel like, in some ways, rather than this is what we need to solve this problem. And this understanding of the whole system, understanding of humans as part of nature, not a separate entity from nature. I mean, that way of thinking is what got us into this problem. And so unless we're fully willing to really work on understanding different ways of thinking and different ways of knowing, we're not going to get out of this problem.
Thank you. I think really illuminating, and I think both emphasizing, particularly for the Western science community, really the need to rebuild that system from the ground up. And I think also some very clear and actionable principles emerging from our speakers about how we do that and how we move forward. So I really appreciate that. And I wonder if we can build on that a little I want to ask if there are examples of best practice, things that you've experienced in your work that are a really positive example of what effective co-production looks like. Anything that you'd like to highlight from your own experiences or your own work?
Yes, I can share some things that I have come to learn to be good practices. One thing is that the team needs to find the right working practices. As one example, not all knowledge holders might be the most efficient working through writing. So, for example, receiving a long email and then expecting a response in 2 days, commenting on a text that might not be the the most efficient way or suitable way for knowledge holders to be engaged in knowledge co-production. So perhaps allowing a space for discussions, to be able to orally express concerns, also explain, let's say, intermediary results orally, and have a discussion rather than just commenting on written text. Another point is that the schedules must be planned together and fit the seasonal work of people, because for example in reindeer herding you cannot decide a month in advance what you do on the 2nd of November at 3 o'clock, but it depends on the weather, what's the snow condition, what's happening, is there a reindeer corral at the moment. So these kinds of evolving schedules have to be accepted as part of the process, and there needs to be flexibility, because these people are actually living their lives and practicing their livelihood, so they are not mainly producing knowledge, but that can be of course done at the same time. Also language is a key question. A lot of the indigenous knowledge is in the language, and especially in reindeer herding, it's one of those arenas where the Sami languages have preserved the best, and there is an immense body of knowledge in the language. So it's very important that this knowledge can be expressed in the Sami language, that you can actually use the concepts in the language, and then those concepts of course have to be like looked into more carefully to see what is actually included in this knowledge. So it can be much more difficult to explain the same amount of information or knowledge in English, for example, if you lack the same words that you have in the Sami language. And I agree that it's important to use time for building relationships, because as I mentioned, one of the challenges is this often mutual lack of respect, or at least knowledge on the other way of knowing. So I think it's important that trust is established, that these people actually get to know one another, that they also perhaps spend time in the field, in the environment that they are researching, so that it's not something that is completely outside of the situation where these matters are being discussed. Also, to highlight one important issue is that often we experience that the researchers that come to our communities, they lack even the basic knowledge of our culture. So big part of the time together is spent on teaching very basics, like what are the Sami people, what are your livelihoods, what are the languages. So a requirement should be that the researchers familiarize themselves with the basics of the cultures of the people that they are collaborating with, so that you don't have to waste the time of indigenous knowledge holders to teach the things that you can learn from Wikipedia in a few minutes. And yes, also I want to emphasize what I mentioned already before, that the ownership of knowledge, it belongs to the communities, and no matter what's the academic practice, but if there is indigenous knowledge that inputs into an academic article, then the ownership of that knowledge belongs to the community itself. It doesn't belong to the researcher, but it has to be the community that maintains the ownership and the right to decide how that knowledge is published and shared and used. And just to final point, I think it's also important to compensate the time that knowledge holders put into research. If the researchers get paid for doing this knowledge production, then I think the same standard should apply also to indigenous knowledge holders. And if they spend time and their expertise into a research project, then yeah, I think they should also be compensated of their efforts. So yeah.
Most interesting many examples of best co-productional results I can give. Uh, for example, in our education system, when we create new types of teaching books with scientists and our traditional knowledge holders work and together, and we see that the results of these books are more better, and now our children start to learn the languages, their culture more better than earlier. Another result, example, is, for example, we have one of the projects with uh, was focused on the factors of resilience of local communities. And one of the results of this work was the recommendations how for adaptations and mitigations to climate change to local communities of the Tixi district in Yakutia. Like this, and some of them was the results with we have an international project with Sami people on reindeer herding, and which Aslak says earlier. So
I just had a couple of points to reemphasize. I agree with everything that's already been said. I sat on a ethical research practices panel recently in Reykjavik with a colleague. His name is Corey Erickson. He's an indigenous researcher, and he said many things that stood out. And one of the things I always remember is the values of your project are reflected in your budget. And so if you have a budget that mostly serves your research team or the university that you're working out of, and then you offer, I don't know, $30 gift cards to the indigenous people who are contributing to the research, then that reflects the values of your budget. Whose knowledge are you really valuing? Whose time are you really valuing? And which community are you really serving if that's what your budget looks like? Um, my 2 cents is that we push back on bureaucracy. We push back on this system that tries to fund 3 to 5 year projects. I used to run a suicide prevention program at a Native organization, and I hustled to get about $1.7 million a year, and it was a hustle. And all of those projects were 3 to 5 years long, and we had to fit our ongoing projects into those 3 to 5 year cycles. And it's something that burns people out. So I understand what you're saying, that there are good people who want to do good work, who are burnt out by the system and who are constrained by that system. And at the same time, I took it upon myself, and many other people did, to push back against that system and to let them know how harmful that is to the community. We have a responsibility as people who are receiving public or private monies to supposedly benefit a community. We have a responsibility to advocate for the community and to share how these 3 to 5 year grant cycles are harming those communities and not allowing for that long-term relationship building that is necessary to do meaningful work. And we're not just harming those communities, we're harming the globe, because the climate crisis, I mean, we're seeing all of the warning signs in our communities right now. We're seeing the massive migratory bird die-offs right now. We're seeing all of the hunting accidents right now. But that's just the beginning. This is the beginning of a global issue. And so the disservice to our community is a disservice to the globe. If we're not making sure that the right voices are at the table and are leading these efforts and identifying the problem and identifying the solutions, then we're really doing a disservice to the entire globe. We're not just looking at, poor, disadvantaged Indigenous peoples, although we have been experiencing a lot of oppression and colonial rule for a long time. But in the long run, this is going to impact your families and your children and your grandchildren. And we don't want to see that either.
Yeah, I think the best practices have already been covered. I guess I'll give a thought and then an example of how we're trying to do this. My first thought is that I think scientists think of themselves as experts. We're often presented as an expert in X, Y, and Z. And so it does require like making your ego go away and be like, okay, I need to learn. And maybe your feelings get hurt because you're like, oh, I didn't do this the right way. But you have to just kind of like get over it and just be like, all right, I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to be open-minded. Maybe I didn't do something the right way before, but let me see how I can do things better. And that takes a little bit of like, you're not like, you may be an expert in a specific area, but there's lots and lots that we don't know. And maybe everybody knows that. Just so one example of how we're trying to do this, we have a new project called Permafrost Pathways. As part of that project, we will be working with 10 partnering tribes in Alaska. So far, there are 4 that we've signed tribal agreements with: Nunavutchik, Quiglingok, Gullivan, and Chivak. And as part of that, it is only, it's a 5-year project, which for scientists, that's quite long, or 6-year project. And each one of the tribes will be hiring a full-time person to work with us through the lifetime of the project. And through that, that person and that community then truly becomes a partner in this, rather than just a person that I'm going in and get some information. And even if I'm giving a stipend and then leaving, it's quite a different relationship. So it's quite a privilege to have this opportunity to have this type of funding and to work in this way. And then I think the other thing I guess I would say is it's kind of simple, but it's really just about being respectful. And I think this idea of not Googling like the people you're going to be on a panel with, or the people you're meeting in a community to learn about like what is the language, like who are the people, who are you meeting with. I don't know anybody that wouldn't do that. Like, it's so easy to get information now. So I think that's unacceptable. Like, that's the least people, scientists or anyone, can be doing when you're going into a new place or going into a new culture. So I think just some really simple things that aren't that very hard, and implementing that like at an institutional level or at a programmatic level is really key in helping to drive that. I think in the scientific community needs that guidance a little bit more. And the information is out there. I will say there are protocols. The ICC has protocols. Like, there is information out there. You just have to look.
Thank you so much. And I have 1 or 2 closing questions, a little bit about COP. But I wonder if first we can just take a little pause and look to our audience and ask if anybody, either here in person or who's watching online, has a question for our panelists. I'll leave that open for a little moment, but happy to move on. And if others do come up with questions, then maybe just give me a little wave and we can come back to that. But then perhaps for now, thank you so much for everything you've shared so far. This has been a really rich discussion already. And I wanted to ask about, as we're all here at COP, given everything that we've discussed so far, are there any conversations happening at COP, whether within the negotiating rooms or elsewhere at COP, that you do feel are helping to move some of what we've discussed forwards, maybe are helping to center or support Indigenous leadership on adaptation or on climate action more generally? And perhaps as a follow-on onto that, are there steps that you feel that the various communities at COP, whether Western scientists or whether policymakers, the folks in the rooms, at the tables and negotiating rooms, are there steps that those communities can take to help move that forwards?
Yes. So what I could mention is that the work that is being done in the indigenous platform, or what is officially the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, they are debating a lot of these same issues that we are discussing here on what are our experiences on the ground, what does our knowledge say about climate change, how should we work together with our knowledge holders, and I think in this platform there is a lot of very valuable discussions and material created that could contribute better to the climate convention process. I'm not sure if that at the moment is having so much of an impact. We don't have a official way of informing the subsidiary bodies, or they don't adopt any of our recommendations or reports or resolutions. So I think currently there lacks this official indigenous way of informing the process. And also another point on the procedural side, I've been working with conventional biological diversity for a decade now, and comparison to that, I think the climate convention is regressive, because in the biodiversity convention, the indigenous caucus, we have the right to speak under each of the items. We have the right to be at the contact groups, at the negotiations. We have the right to propose language changes on the floor. And to me, as I said, it's regressive that in the climate convention we don't have that room, that we are fully relying on the state parties to lobby them to speak on our behalf, while as on the biodiversity convention it's the other way around, that we are able to speak for ourselves. And of course we do need party support for our proposal. It is a party driven process, so but it does flip the table around, and when we are able to present our views by ourselves. So I think there is something that the climate convention process could learn from the biodiversity work.
I want to add that this is my fifth COP, and I see that now I see many events where our indigenous peoples are involved. Some events are organized by our LCIP platform, local indigenous peoples and local communities platform, and many side events where our traditional knowledge holders, our activists, and our peoples are involved, like this side event, I mean, and it shows that it's something changed. And we hope that COP27 will be start the process from ambitions to results, to real results for us.
It is a huge disservice to the globe and to the UN and to everyone that Indigenous peoples must compete with corporations and lobbyists in order to gain any influence over our colonial states, which are the ones that are the only ones that are recognized and represented here. It is my belief that Indigenous nations should be recognized as individual states and not as part of these colonial states. But not everybody shares that view, and I understand that. But until that has happened, I'm not going to be satisfied.
Yeah, I'd say I'd agree with that. And I think one other thing to bring up is I think that there's a lack of recognition that sovereign indigenous nations of the North are not part of the conversation when we're thinking about loss and damage, loss of lands, loss of ways of living, and that's problematic, and it's partly because they're couched or colonized by these wealthier countries, but there's not the support there, and so I would like to see that change.
Thank you. And we are coming up to the end of the hour. So perhaps just as a final question, I'd like to ask you, what is it that you would like to see come from this COP? What does a successful COP look like to you? And any other closing remarks that you'd like to share?
So I feel like my reasons for coming to COP might be different than other people's reasons. And so where I find successes are in the relationship building. And I feel like we've already succeeded in that. I'm building new relationships right now. And yeah.
Well, I think a successful COP would be that would make decisions that would make emissions drop and not grow.
And another result of this COP, it's destroy new barriers which are created from our government, our policies, because we are here and our voice are listened.
I don't know what to add. So interpersonal relationships, relationships between breaking down barriers and reducing fossil fuel emissions. That's all we ask. I have nothing to add.
It's powerful and succinct responses. Thank you so much. And I'd like to just reiterate my thanks to all our panelists. I've learned an enormous amount just in the last hour, and I'd like to thank you for your openness and for your energy and for your time in sharing your expertise and your perspectives and your knowledge with us. So with that, I think if there's not other questions from the audience, then I'll close the session, and our next session begins at 11:30, focusing on some specific aspects. Oh, I think actually we have a question from the floor. So
one of the challenges discussed was the one of the challenges discussed was the limitations of the existing grant system and funding system. So I guess two questions would be: are there examples of other sources of funding that have worked well, or what would the ideal funding structure look like if there was an alternative?
So when we were discussing this very thing at Arctic Assembly in Reykjavik, we talked about how the funding system is very backwards right now. Rather than universities being granted these large grants, it would be better if communities who wanted research done to register to receive the funding, and then researchers apply to the communities for that funding. That way it's coming directly from frontline communities, and then they can prioritize indigenous experts versus Western experts, or both, on their own terms and within their own frameworks. That's what would work probably the best. And the other thing is, of course, private funding has always been better than federal or state funding. And some private funders are getting better about empowering and leaning on frontline communities to lead how their funding is spent and how their funding is granted. And there are, I feel like the Climate Justice Resilience Fund is one of those funding sources that's really, really trying. I see them really, really trying. So maybe take a look at them.
And I believe it's less than 1% of funding that currently funding to climate work currently goes to indigenous peoples and communities and our organizations. So I think that number should significantly grow, and we have a lot of indigenous led organizations, communities who have the capacity to receive funding and run projects, be that adaptation or mitigation projects or knowledge co-production projects, or we have existing bodies that could be strengthened. So I don't think we need to invent everything from the beginning, but we have structures that could be strengthened, and through that the collaboration could be improved.
On my view, the main challenge that we are still the objects of this process, not the subjects.
I don't have anything to add. I think I think if funding agencies thinking about climate science in the U.S., it's mainly the National Science Foundation, NASA. Funding should go to there should be funding that can go to the tribes. It may not be impossible, but I think it's the way the system is set up right now. It's essentially impossible. So,
Thank you. I think we have another question, perhaps. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Lokol Paul. I am a pastoralist from Karamoja, Uganda. And I want to commend the contribution made by Ashlak about the knowledge that we have, the knowledge which is free to be accessed, and then the knowledge that has got, which is private, that has got financial implications. I also want to say the scientists have said there must be really money for the tribes, like NASA has put for scientists. There should be money committed for us, the indigenous people, so that those specialists can take advantage and then contribute to the knowledge process. Now, the question I want to ask the panelists is, what is your vision about how do you envision the coordination of these indigenous communities? I mean, how can they work together to ensure that co-production is realized? Which mechanisms do you see can work for us all so that it can reach you in the Arctic, it can also reach us in the dry desert of Uganda? Thank you.
Well, I think one tool could be, well, based on the issues what I was describing quite quite extensively, is you could have protocols stating these facts. What are the requirements that organizations or communities want to have in place before engaging with the research projects? And then I think this kind of protocols could be upscaled or adopted by other communities as a tool to ensure good cooperation. And of course, I believe that you would learn as you take part in this kind of work. So it should be an evolving set of guidelines or protocols to guide the work.
And I think if the funds, institutes, academia recognize the main principle, nothing about us without us, and the free, prior, and informed consent, and put this principle in their work, maybe this is one of the way.
Many of our communities are forming ethical research committees. We're all we've all experienced the situation where a scientist comes to our community and there are well-aware leadership at the front of that community, and they understand why that research might be harmful to our community, and so they say no. So what does that scientist do? They pick up their operation, they move over to the next community in our region, and they keep asking and asking and asking until somebody says yes. So there are alliances and committees being formed in our communities to as a way for us to share information with one another about what things might be harmful and why. So we're a bit better armed in ensuring that there are ethical practices in our community. Free, prior, and informed consent is one of the most important parts of that. Basically, just tribal sovereignty, tribal self-determination, us being empowered to make decisions, well-informed decisions about what we want in our communities and what we don't want. I feel like just across the board, whether it's research or food sovereignty or anything, that's what would resolve a lot of stuff.
Thank you. I think we have time for one final question in the last couple of minutes, and then we will wrap up.
Thank you so much. My name is Guti Mark. I'm also a pastoralist, and I come together with Paul from the same area. I come from Uganda, and I would like to add my voice to what the panelists are saying. We do acknowledge that most of the indigenous knowledge is what the scientists are actually relying on, and we are proud that much of the discoveries, much of the medicines, much of whatever is being done now is based on the indigenous knowledge. If we're talking about food security, it comes from the indigenous knowledge. And so this is really something which is great. And we feel that we need to be recognized and be felt that we have a contribution to make in this world. And so when it also comes to the issues of law financing, we have seen this as a key challenge for us as the indigenous people. We are not felt in terms of investments. So how much do we engage? How much are the donors actually trying to put in place in order to help the indigenous communities to be able to address the key challenges that we are faced with at the community level? Take, for example, the discoveries of medicine. If we don't plant the trees, if we don't plant those herbs, we cannot be able to get that. And it needs financing. So my question to the panelists is, how do we engage in terms of ensuring that we adequately have enough finances to address some of these lower challenges? Then the other second issue is around the gender, climate and gender. How do we recognize the gender in the work that we are doing at the community level? Our women are faced with challenges of low incomes, and yet they can rely on indigenous knowledge to discover something, to earn a living within their community. So how do we ensure that the gender, our women are actually empowered to be able to speak and be able to lead some of the processes of this, and also working with the scientists to share the knowledge that we have at the community level? And I believe that in the next for us, maybe while we are discussing, is there a possibility of ensuring that we have women-led, youth-led interventions, especially on the indigenous, where we can have all the youth, all the women come together with beautiful ideas and share with us in this kind of fora. So my question is, are there plans that we're actually putting in place to ensure that we can actually bring together all our knowledge together and be able to showcase at even different levels in the world? Thank you.
Maybe the answer in your questions, because you say about it, and I think that, and it's come in from two sides. Once from the top level, from the international organization, from the states, which must recognize this problem and involve all the parties to this process. And another, it's from the bottom, from our communities, that where we try to rise these problems. We must keep and promote all these problems on all the levels.
This is a really difficult, very complex. I think sometimes people, there's a misconception that Indigenous people hold this knowledge that can help save the system as it is right now. But really, Indigenous peoples hold the knowledge for how we can change the system so we can exist and thrive as a human race. So it's not our knowledge that you can extract and inject into the existing system in order to allow the system to continue as it is right now. The system as it is right now is what got us into this mess. And so we have to reevaluate how we are doing things, how we are living on this planet. And that involves looking at things like gender, that involves looking at things like race. But the answer is we have to change how we're doing things. Because if we don't, Earth is going to be fine. She has shown us time and time again that she knows how to adapt. Father Sky repaired himself at the beginning of the pandemic. The ozone repaired itself. So the Earth and Mother Earth, Father Sky are going to be fine. It's people that might not be okay. And so we have to prepare our homes. We have to teach our youth, and we have to continue through a multi-generational process, preparing ourselves for the more difficult times that are going to come ahead. And Indigenous people, we have the knowledge to help shift how we can survive as a human race, not within the confines of the system that we're trying to exist in right now, because that's not working.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really important and powerful note to end on. And I'd also highlight that the aspect of centering our youth will be having here at 1 p.m. a panel focusing on intergenerational justice. So there will be space then to dig a bit more into that really important question. But again, I would just like to thank you so much for your participation, and thank you so much to our panelists. And we will be reconvening at 11:30. Thank you.